alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode on the Mrs. Elmi group. Today we have Mohammed Artan, and the topic is Introduction to Somali History, Scratching the Surface. So, Mohammed, can you tell us about yourself, please?
Yeah, as you said, my name is Mohammed Artan. I was born in Somalia, where is a city known as al-Ḥabashah, sort of southwest in modern-day Somalia. I grew up there first decade of my life, and the civil war happened, and we were one of those fortunate enough that got out of it on time, and we settled and moved to the Netherlands in Holland. In what was 1992, I believe, in December. So yeah, I lived there my teenager years, grew up there, moved to UK around about 2003, and have been here since then. And this is where I basically lived in most of my adult life, I would say.
MashaAllah, tabarakallah. So, yeah. As I've said before, our topic today is Introduction to Somali History, Scratching the Surface, as you said. What have you prepared for us? And is this topic divided into sections? How are we going to introduce this topic to our viewers today?
The first thing that I would like to talk about is, when we're talking about Somali history, in essence, is try to understand first who is telling the story of Somalis, who is telling the stories of the Somalis, okay? So, and why are they telling it the way they're telling? Because, you know, when someone tells a story, they have to tell it in a way that is suitable to them, in a way that is easy for them to unpack the story, and also put their little bit of bias in there. And so then it also informs you as a listener or someone who is unpacking those stories. It informs your worldview on how you take these histories. And so depending on whose version of the history you take in, you will come away with different understanding to, say, typically someone who is of your peers, right? And so the first thing, inshallah, I want to sort of talk about is, what is Somali historiography, right? What is Somali historiography, i.e., how do historians study Somali history? And who are the scholars, in essence, that we go back to in terms of a resource, as well as their academic endeavors. So that is a segment, inshallah, that I will talk about, okay? And within this segment, I will talk about something that I like to call schools of thought. And this is something that Dr. Badio and others have engineered, and to talk about and sort of bulk all these scholars and their works in different schools of thoughts. And we will understand what these schools of thoughts are, their impact, who are the pioneers within those various opinions out there, and as well as their resources and their books, okay? And so once we unpack that, we sort of have to then look at what is the geography of the Somali Peninsula, okay? So what does it mean to understand the history of that land, or that part of Africa, what is known as today the Horn of Africa, right? And so that is a segment, inshallah, that we'll talk about in terms of the importance of that landmass, and how the world civilizations throughout time seen the importance of that landmass, okay? And then we'll talk about ethnography, the theme of ethnography, i.e. studying the ethnicities and the peoples that live that part of the land, okay, in the Somali Peninsula. So who are they? What we know as Somalis, you know, their background, where do they come from? Are they, as people express, homogeneous people? Are they like one type of people, or do they come from different backgrounds? Do they have different cultures? Do they have different take of the way they see the world? And how do we convey their stories and their histories? Okay, and so that is the ethnography within that topic. And then we talk about, inshallah, an element of linguistics or languages, okay? The origins of certain languages that are spoken in the Horn of Africa, okay? Where do they come from? How do they trace? How do they affect each other? What are typically seen as a language, and what is seen a subsection of a language. So what is born out of these main languages, for example, okay? And what is the importance of these languages, you know, because how we speak and how we convey ourselves and how we tell our stories and how we talk to one another and how we describe the world around us, whether those would be the trees, the land mass itself, the things that we do typically, how we do and how we communicate those things sort of shape our worldview, right? And so we have to sort of understand where these languages come from and who they are and their importance, okay? And then we have the last element that I would like to conclude with, which is how do people believe? What are the belief systems? What were the traditional belief systems in that part of the world, right? And how do they relate to each other? Are they typically what scholars used to call traditional African religions, right? Or do we have religions that are similar to what the major three Abrahamic faiths were built on? So we look at the theology in this section and how these belief systems in the Somali Peninsula formulated what their names are, inshallah. And so I will keep to that because that's a lot of ground to cover, bi-idhnillahi kareem.
Okay, so let's start with your first segment.
Okay. Let me have a zip. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So we're talking about Somali history, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when we say Somali history, and how history informs our worldview, right? And how we take a set of information or set of incidents or set of data or set of facts that has happened in the past, and how we take that and analyze it today, and then sort of convey that as some sort of a holistic image of an incident or a larger context of a world, depends on whose information we take in, the sets of data that we take in. So then the question, sort of a rudimentary question that I like to open with these sessions is, what is more important, what is more devastating, what is more impactful to the person in a negative way? Is it misreading or miswriting? Which of those two is more problematic? So is it misreading something more problematic, or is it miswriting? So that is a question that I would like to leave out there in the air, and hopefully, inshallah, at the end of the session, we can sort of unpack that the answer of that question within the session, right? So, what is more drastic or negatively impacts us, our worldview of history? Is it the misreading of history, or is it miswriting of history? Okay, so I'll leave that question out there for you guys to marinate and maybe get the answers. And hopefully, if I've done my job right, I should have given you the answer within this session. Okay, so let's jump into the topic, the Somali historiography. Okay, so various schools of thought exist about how one studies and critiques and interprets Somali history. Okay, and each one of those schools of thoughts, each one of those opinions, or each one of those thought process have a drastic consequence depending on how we take that and then sort of pass those informations along, right? And so these school of thoughts in terms of Somali history are as follows. And inshallah, I will make these school of thoughts. I've made these school of thought into various segments. Some of these segments have come from a beautiful work that Dr. Abdurrahman Badio has written, which is called Making Sense of Somali History, Volume 1. So this book is in 2 volumes. And by the way, throughout these sessions, I'll be referencing a lot of work, and inshallah, I'm hopeful that later on down the line, you can consult these works, you can buy them online, you can support the authors, you can go back to these sources yourself and read them and understand the histories that's contained within them. So the work that I just mentioned is by Dr. Badio, which is titled Making Sense of Somali History, Volume 1. And Volume 1 is quite really important work because it goes back to the root of the problem in terms of making sense of Somali history. And it's really quite a good work, especially if you look at the first couple of chapters where the author tries to unpack how we understand Somali history and why we have those views about Somali history, okay? And so let's start with the most apparent school of thought, okay? And this is a school of thought that is known as the modernization method or modernization methodology, okay? And so this school of thoughts, or the modern school of thoughts, basically comes from the tradition of modernity, okay? So looking at Somali history from the prospect of, from the perspective of a modernity, of the modern worldview. And that means looking from the perspective of Western, what is it called? Western, I forgot the word I was looking for, Western eye, basically, right? Mm-hmm. And so this theory essentializes the demise of tradition, which means the tradition that it sort of tries to unpack and sort of discuss and to explain that people have moved on or have moved away from is the tradition known as the Islamic tradition and the clan in the Somali caves, right? And this is one point that Dr. Badio makes in his book that we just talked about, Making Sense of Somali History, okay? And so who are the champions within these schools and what do they say? So some of the early champions of these schools that we have are some of the famous Western scholars that are out there, or what we would traditionally known as Orientalist scholarship, right? Mm-hmm. There are, for example, Richard Burton. Richard Burton, whether you want to call him famous or infamous, right, is the author who wrote that title called First Footsteps of East Africa, grandiose title. But what he's essentially trying to say is that I'm the first non-Somali who landed there and sort of unpacked and tries to understand the Somali culture, the Somali peninsula. And it's got a lot of information about certain clans, how they moved, conflicts, traditions, set of histories that predate his time that he came, but also a lot of assumptions about the Somali culture, Somali clan system, as well as the Somali identity of Islam. And a lot of these information are, depending on how you unpack them, very problematic, okay? So that is Richard Burton, who has written his work in 1850s, okay? There are a couple of other Western scholars who came before him, but in terms of the impact that they had on Somali history compared to Richard Burton, is slightly nominal. Richard Burton has been one of those guys who are sort of the Bible of historians when it comes to Western academics in terms of looking at Somali history, okay? And so then you have also Enrico Cirilli, who is exactly like Richard Burton in many ways, but comes from the different part of the Western Hemisphere, which is the Italian tradition, okay? And so these are two scholars are representative from the empires that are in the midst of scramble for the Horn of Africa at the time in the 1850s, 1890s, early 1900s something. So Enrico Torelli is an Italian scholar who's been a governor for a while in what is today Eritrea and parts of Somalia. And he was for a while working in what was known as the Italian Somaliland. And so he's written ferociously around the topic of Somali culture, Somali history, Somali Dhaqan, Somali, how do you call it, Somali hair, Somali customary law. He's written a lot on Somali customary law. And most of his material, if not all, are written in Italic or Italian. And so going back to those sources means that you've been exposed to Italian language, or you have to understand Italian language. And so he's got he's got 3-part volume that he calls Somalia 1, Somalia 2, Somalia 3. And these are 3 volumes that he has written, and he talks about Somali history. Slightly difference between him and Richard Burton is that the fact that Torelli focuses a lot on the Islamic tradition about the Somali history. So there's a lot of material from the Arabic sources that he translated, that he actually codified within his work. Some of these actually works are only kept in his own writings because we don't have access to the original material anymore, unfortunately. And so that is a scholar that is out there, and I'll talk about how he shaped Somali studies in that essence. And by the way, for those of you who are not familiar with what Somali studies is the academic field that was set up in the 1970s, 80s by a host of scholars, Somalist scholars, designed to study Somali culture, language, and everything about the Somali history. So that's what is known as Somali studies, right? And so we will be mentioning that frequently, inshallah, down the line. And then you have the most famous scholars of them all, Ian Merritt Lewis, or I.M. Lewis. And Lewis is a scholar who wrote a lot on Somali history, Somali culture, religion, Islam, how Somali clans live and how they move. Specifically, he specialized a lot in what is now known as Somaliland, all right? Or Waqooyi, or the northern parts of the Somali Peninsula. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so in that essence, a lot of his initial research was designed in the 50s and in the 60s to come from that background. Somalis had due to him, I think, and various other scholars that came later, they had a funny anecdote, funny saying, so that means like leave our kafir alone, or leave our non-Muslim alone. And they said that is because, you know, a lot of these scholars, what they did in essence is when they spent quite a lot of time with certain clans or certain Somalis within the Somali Peninsula, they obviously were well informed in that worldview, right? And so that's what they wrote about, that's what they unpacked, that's what they analyzed, that's what they brought out. And in essence, then a lot of scholars and then a lot of readers would come away from thinking, oh yeah, that history is informed from that perspective of that clan, for example, right? Or that part of the world. And so that anecdote came to be to say, oh, you know, leave our non-Muslim alone, because, you know, a lot of people were criticizing whether they would criticize Lewis, or whether they would criticize Torelli, whether they would criticize other scholars that came after them. And so that specialized in certain areas of the Somali Peninsula. And that's how people sort of became defensive towards those traditions. And me personally, I don't see anything wrong with that. I see that as a beautiful, rich tradition being expounded and brought forward, with obviously some problematic views, but nonetheless, I'd rather have that than nothing at all, okay? And so
which one would you prefer out of the three? Which one do you lean towards and that is less biased, I would say, out of the three authors?
I wouldn't say they're are any that are less biased, because as I said, even me talking to you, I have my bias. So everybody will have their bias, right?
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to say is that the more they've written about the subject, the more time they've spent, the more research they did, the more informed they were, and the more the less problematic views that they had. Some of them anyway, not all of them, right? And so I would say definitely Lewis is the father of Somali studies, right? And I'm not saying this because I personally like the guy and his work and everything else, but that is what he's known as in terms of Somali studies, because he's actually written so much around the Somali history that you cannot avoid him without consulting in terms of academic world. That's what I'm talking about today, without consulting, specifically in the time that he was busy doing his research. Definitely a lot of people growing up, and we will talk about that also in the next segment, how he became, he influenced many scholars that came out of the Somali Peninsula. And I'm talking about Somali scholars themselves, as well as non-Somalis. He basically influenced the host of scholarship around his material and his written works, okay?
Okay.
And so probably Lewis, I would say, is the most consulted scholar, right? Richard Burton hasn't written that much. Enrico Cirelli has written a lot as well, but they are almost all in the Italian languages, and none or almost none of them have, as far as I know, the main works have been translated into English or other mainstream languages. So that's also a problem itself. But his resources, and he was more humble in the sense that the information and the facts and the data that he accumulated and the way he brought it was informed from the Islamic tradition, the clan tradition, the hair and the Dhaqan in that sense. And so he tried to codify a lot of this material and put them out there and assessed less of the material, whereas Lewis is someone who assessed a lot. So I'll move on from those three scholars.
And then that takes us to our next segment now.
Yeah, before I go to the next segment, then there is also Virginia Lulling. Virginia Lulling is a British scholar as well, an English scholar. She passed away about a decade ago, I think 2012, 2011 she passed away. She specialized in what we known as the Geledi area, South Somalia, really deep in the hinterlands, right? And she's written a lot, specifically her research and the time that she spent in that part of the world. She's written a work called Geledi Sultanate, right? Her PhD was around that. And so her studies is around that as well. Then you have Saeed Sheikh Samatar also, who is part of that modernization methodology. And Saeed Sheikh Samatar, although he is, I would say, well-informed and a product of a lot of what Lewis writes, a lot of what Cirelli writes and others, but he is also unique in the sense that he was on the scene quite early on with his research, right? And so his PhD was around oratory and poetry, Somali oratory and Somali poetry in terms of how we convey our histories in that segment. And his case study was around the Sayyid. So the Sayyid Mohammed Abdullah Hassan was his case study in terms of how he unpacks oratory in Somali history, right? And so his work was called Oral Poetry, blah blah something. Google it, inshallah, you will find it. Saeed Sheikh Samatar, Oral Poetry, the case of Mohammed Abdullah Hassan, Sayyid Mohammed Abdullah Hassan, right? And so that is one of the things. So being the dominant paradigm in the 1950s and the 1960s, most leaders of the nationalist movements in the Somali Peninsula in post-colonial states followed this modernization theory, okay? This means including the Somali nationalists. So this is really, we have to really understand how this methodology impacts our psyche and how we understand Somali history. Okay, so this is a segment. This is to say that a lot of the people who were working towards Somali unification, anti-colonial movements, Somali state building, they were all almost all of them were informed from this perspective. Okay, and so that shaped also in a way the way we sort of understand. And so these Somali nationalists were influenced by the theory of modernization and adapted nationalistic programs and policies as well of eradicating a lot of the times these traditions that we had of clanism or clan or Islam or hair or customary law. So they saw these things as some sort of things that we should walk away from, move away from, because it has not brought us an advancement, it has not brought us to the modern world. And that has been informed from that modernization method, okay? And this perspective has been criticized for its limitation, right? And because really limited, and this is what Badio argues in making sense of Somali history, that this perspective has been criticized.